Hello, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. We are super excited to be speaking with all of you today and to be learning from these two incredible scholars that we have right in front of us. They have a wealth of information, and we are so excited to learn how we can apply what we're learning here into our daily lives and learn more about very nuanced and complex issues. So just before we head into this, as we wait for more people to come in, we're just going to go through some guidelines to get us started. So Girl Up, BFS, and Black Ed will not tolerate any and all forms of hate, discriminations, or microaggressions. If you are engaging in this event in an inappropriate manner, then you will be kicked out of the event. Please stay on mute, but that being said, we still want to hear from you. So this is supposed to be an interactive panel discussion. Use the chat feature, engage with our panelists, share your experience and your thoughts and your reflections throughout the panel. And remember, please send in any questions. Another reminder, this event is recorded and will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel after this event is done. Feel free to show your lovely face if you feel comfortable using video. And lastly, please show the moderators and speakers your utmost compassion and patience. So with that, hello, I'm Shira Gralbard. I am president of Girl Up Edinburgh, and Girl Up Edinburgh is a UN Foundation campaign with chapters all around the world, all focused on empowerment, on creating more empowerment opportunities as a means for illuminating and eliminating the patriarchal consequences that we see in our everyday lives around us. So Girl Up has teamed up with Blackhead Movement to create BFS, Black Feminist Space, and I'm going to pass it on to Sharisa and Millie, who are our great, incredible BFS officers who are going to moderate and be leading the session. Please, as always, feel free to private message me if you have any questions about Girl Up, BFS, Black Ed, this session, as well as future involvement.
Thanks, Shira. So I'll just introduce Blackhead quickly. So the Blackhead movement was founded by some amazing Black female students at the University of Edinburgh to try and pressure the university to tackle more issues that affect the BAME community, to create networks, to inform people about Black culture and Black history, and also to create a kind of safe community and student culture for Black students at the University of Edinburgh. And this term already we've set up into loads and loads of different groups. We've got our outreach, our Black feminist space, which Charissa will explain that we're part of, and we've just been part of a lot of initiatives to make a welcoming space for Black students at the university, and Black feminist space is one of them. So I'll pass you on to Charissa to briefly explain what that is.
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name's Charissa, and I work with Shira and Millie. They're phenomenal, and they brought in phenomenal panelists that we're excited to hear about from today. As Millie mentioned, we are Black Feminist Space, and we have teamed up with Girl Up today. And we are a specific project group within the Black Ed movement. So we were born to cater for, a side of feminism that typically does not, that typically ignores those that do not conform with white mainstream feminism. So we just wanted to create a safe space that's comfortable for everyone and anyone that identifies as females. We've constructed a Facebook group that y'all maybe you have joined or haven't joined, but thank you so much for coming, and I pass the baton on to Renee to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about your feminist journey and your road to becoming a reproductive justice heroine.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Renee Bracey Sherman. My pronouns are she and her. I am an abortion, reproductive justice activist, a writer, and I founded the organization We Testify, which is dedicated to the leadership and representation of people who have abortions. I'm originally from Chicago, but I pay rent in Washington, D.C. But of course, in the pandemic, I am quarantining with family in New York. So yeah, my feminist journey. Well, I think it took me a while to get to it. I had a hard time kind of considering myself a feminist because I thought in order to be a feminist, you had to like read all of the right books and like be grounded in feminist theory and all this stuff, and like understand it in college and whatever, but not understanding that actually it's just how you show up in the world. And yes, you can continue to learn more about theory and all of that, but also it is a political view of how you believe that people of all genders should be supported. And I think part of the reason that I was turned off a bit to feminism was because of white feminists and their ignorance around inclusion of race and class and gender identity as part of the conversation. So I didn't necessarily see myself in the conversation. I remember in college, I took a gender studies class, and it was my first one in undergrad. And my professor, she was a white woman. She basically showed us a bunch of videos, music videos, Shakira, Beyonce. I think there was a Britney Spears might have been in there at some point, but they were mostly women of color in the videos. And she was trying to make the point about the way in which in the videos, there were like animal print overlays onto the women and like sexuality and all of that kind of stuff. And she basically was like, they can't be feminists because they're sexy. And because, they're embracing their sexuality in this way that, the assumption that it was for a male gaze. And then she complained about Beyonce's song Single Ladies because she said that it was a song about telling women that they should get married. And I remember being like, actually, she says she's up in the club and her ex-boyfriend's there and he's dancing with somebody else in her Darion jeans. And she's like, if you like it, you should have put a ring on it. Like, I wanted to be with you, but you weren't trying to commit. So fine, I'm going to go do what I want to do. And so she's like, I'm a single lady. And that was this moment that I really felt like, oh, wow. So if I like Beyonce and Shakira, I guess I'm not really a feminist because I like this pop culture. And that was really, really challenging and really frustrating of this like one view of like what feminism could be and what sexuality should and could look like. Ironically, now I've been given the title of Beyonce of abortion storytelling, and Beyonce sent me some Ivy Park 2 weeks ago. So who's laughing now, Professor? But I think that we can have a larger conversation. You can critique the media you love. I think that's important, right? And to say that hey, there are ways in which that women are being degraded in some music videos or in songs, but nobody seems to complain about country music degrading women. It's only the music that's made by Black and brown people. But I also think that we need to change our conversation and stop saying things like, twerking is inherently anti-feminist, and that anytime a woman is being sexual or engaging in something like beautiful or twerking or whatever, that it's automatically assuming it's for the male gaze. And I think that is where, when I found intersectionality as a home and understanding how racism can still operate within white feminism, that really shifted my worldview. And that's how I was able to come into feminism that felt good for me.
Cool. And then we hand it over to the next panelist, please.
Oh, Sinai, go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, great. So, hi everyone. My name is Janae Epps. I am the program director of the My Sister's Keeper program at Black Women's Health Imperative. Black Women's Health Imperative is a national organization dedicated to the health and wellness of Black women and girls. Our organization was founded in 1983 on the campus of Spelman College by our founder, Billie Avery, who is a women's health activist and has been doing the work. And she's still an active member of our board and very much still active within BWHI. And so I guess when we talk about like my introduction or how I came to be involved with reproductive justice, I think when I was younger, as a child, obviously, I recognized what was happening around me, in the context of someone being born with chronic conditions, being born with asthma, and then also having a family history of cysts and fibroids and things of that nature, right? And so when these things were happening to me at such a young age, I really didn't understand it, right? I knew it was happening. I knew it was happening to other people in my family that looked like me. I heard stories of when, family members would come over and, that silent conversation, right? It's like, something happened, but you don't know quite sure. And I remember my mom, I remember her having surgery and needing to get fibroids removed and seeing a picture of it, right? So like this huge fibroid that was removed from her. And I'm like, well, how did that fit there, right? So as a child, I'm thinking of all those things and I really didn't put into context until I said, okay, well, I'm going to decide to go to school. First generation, everyone else in my family really didn't see the need, right, for higher education. But I knew in the context of me coming from a low income family and knowing the environment in which I live and the conditions that I had developed as a young child and how where I lived impacted that. So living in a low income community and knowing that my asthma is triggered by the place in which we live. So just, and then getting older and understand, okay, well, let me go off to college. So I study health education. And so that's when I didn't get the introduction to reproductive justice, right? I said, okay, well, I want to focus on women's health, right? Obviously Black women's health, right? Because find the connection for me. And it wasn't until I was in college where I understood that it was so many factors that had contributed to our health that as I reflected on it and obviously learning theories and things, I'm like, so that's why this happened in my family. So this is why this happened to me. And so understanding the connections, right? And it's when education, you always want to find the real world connection. And I started to notice it within myself. And so I interned with Black Women's Health Imperative as an undergraduate student. And I had my introduction to a national organization that was solely focused on it. But it wasn't until I was in the master's program and I interned at Black Women's Health Imperative again. Not always happen. It doesn't always happen, but I had to convince them. I said, I'm going to be working on something different. Let me go back. Because I knew this is where I wanted to be in my focus. And so it wasn't until when I was in the master's program that I was exposed to reproductive justice. I knew about sexual and reproductive health, right? And so that was my thing. I'm like, okay, well, I focused on that, educating about how to prevent diseases and how to take care of yourself, all of that. But I'm like, I wasn't exposed to reproductive justice until that time. And so I just think about reproductive justice and how many other folks don't come to the realization of how everything intersects in our lives by the powers that be, right? And how we have to organize and tell our stories and organize around it to really make a difference in this space for us to achieve it. And so honestly, I really don't know if that was the best introduction, but I just wanted to provide some context, because definitely piggybacking off of Renee, I was like, let me add my storytelling into this. So you definitely sparked that in me, so thank you for that. But I think that kind of led me up to how I got involved with reproductive justice. And obviously the My Sister's Keeper program started out in 2015 as solely focusing on sexual and reproductive health rights and justice, but we have since expanded it to cover more focus areas, right? So not only sexual and reproductive health, rights and justice, but mental and emotional health, menstrual insecurity and stigma, even adding anti-tobacco smoking and vaping, gender discrimination and violence, as well as anti-racism and allyship. So just broaden it, because all of it intersects, and obviously in order for us to really educate on it and to make a difference, we have to be aware of all that is entails. So that's my introduction. So thank you guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to both of our panelists for their introductions. And so now we'll move on to the questions. So the first question for you two to discuss, it's quite a broad one, but kind of how would you define reproductive justice, and why do you think it's so important? And maybe just a little bit about its history as well.
Now you can. Yeah.
Okay, all right, I'll take that. So like,
Yeah.
for me, how I would define reproductive justice and why it's important, well, obviously it's the right to have a child or not to have a child, right? We have to remember that. It's not all about us producing children. You know, we have that right to say if we do or if we don't, but then also to do either of those in a safe and healthy environment. So, you know, that's what reproductive justice, you know, means to me and how I would define it. But, you know, it's so important because the reproductive justice framework shows us the connection between what happens with reproductive health, so the services we receive, then reproductive rights, so our right to abortion and being able to receive it, but then also reproductive justice, tying in the movement building piece to it and getting us to organize around it to really uplift the framework and how it is applied to our daily lives. So I'll start with that and turn it over to Renee.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I get asked this a lot, and so I think one of the shorthands I use is like, it's if, when, and how to decide, right? You decide if, when, and how to have a child, to grow your family. I also use that phrase. I think and also then if, when, and how to decide to grow your family and to be able to raise your family free from violence and coercion. And I also think that part's really important, because just because you can have a kid doesn't mean that you have the ability to raise them safely. And that can be for fear of violence because of war, because of police violence, because of an abuser in your family, in your home, or because of like economic violence and coercion, because, you know, you're not getting paid a living wage and you can't afford to have a home, a safe, healthy home, or enough food on the table. And then of course, because there's like things where people, you know, as you're saying, like there are a lot of different plants and things that are in Black communities that emit like smoke, right? So like incinerators and other sorts of like buildings that cause asthma for young kids, particularly kids of color, right? So it's not just about the act of reproduction, but what does it take for us as a family and as a community, nation, and a world to be able to care for the next generation? And I think it's really important to mention that reproductive justice is a term that was coined by Black activists, a dozen Black activists in 1994. They had come back from a meeting in Cairo, as the legend goes, and they were meeting up in Chicago and just discussing how they had so much more in common with reproductive and feminist activists all around the world than they did with white women in the United States, because of the increased segregation and class like warfare, and just the way that that poor and Black and brown and queer and immigrants and disabled folks are treated in the United States. And so they felt like, actually, we need a new framework that's based in human rights law, meaning that, you know, you have access to it. I will also say, just as context, the way that the rest of the world uses human rights law and like A, abides by it, but B, uses it as a framework to say things like healthcare, education, home, food, all of those things. Everyone must have access to them, and the government should be working to provide that. The community should be working to provide that. The United States does not talk about that at all. And so when I first heard of them saying that reproductive justice, it was built in like the idea of human rights law, I thought they just meant like as a human right, everybody should have access to like a human right. But then I didn't realize until like a couple of years later that, oh, there's like a whole doctrine and a whole human rights law. Like that's what you all are talking about. There's a real law. And because we're not taught that in American schools at all. It is like American policies and American laws and nothing else. And we're taught that America is the best nation on the planet. There's no reason to go see what the other countries have because ours is just better anyway. So what's the point, right? And I find that that actually really impacts reproductive health care because people assume that the service delivery, the way it is given, whether it's for pregnancy and labor, for abortion, contraception, any of those things, that what's in the US is the best. And it's, I mean, even though there are restrictions, like it's the standard. And this is honestly as best as you're going to get. And they don't recognize that around the world, people have access to contraception over the counter and self-manage their abortions with pills all the time. You can just go pick it up at the pharmacy and like have it mailed to you. That we actually don't have to have as high of a maternal mortality rate as we do for Black and brown folks. A lot of people don't give birth in hospitals. All of these things, like midwives abound, people have doulas. You don't get a bill at the end of your treatment. Your birth doesn't cost $20,000. You're not stuck with all these bills. They don't necessarily, they're starting to like, oh, huh, that's weird. And they hear about Canada. It's as close as they get is Canada. They're like, oh yeah, prescription pills cost cheaper in Canada. And that's it. And they don't actually think about how do we change the service and model of care and have it valued in people's autonomy, and that people are inherently valuable and that human rights matter. And I think that is why our system suffers as a consequence. And I think it's very much based in the American like way of individualism and racism and capitalism and all of that. And where reproductive justice fits in is that it's actually asking us to upend the entire system, right? It's saying, actually, this shouldn't be a one person thing. Like this shouldn't be up to an individual, that we as a community should take care of each other and make sure that everyone, no matter how much money they make, no matter where they live, no matter how many children they have or don't have, they should have access to care and they shouldn't have to beg for it. And so it's really, really asking that we challenge the entire system. And I think we're having an indictment of that system right now with the coronavirus pandemic, because not only are all of the pro-life people showing their asses because they are the reason we have, you know, I don't even know what the number is at this point, but it's well over 250,000 people have died. And I think we're over 7 million cases, positive cases of coronavirus. Because they don't want to make access to healthcare available to everyone. They don't want to make sure that poor folks have what they need. And they're like, I'm fine. So it's just me and my family and I'm good. So I shouldn't have to care about anyone else. And I think when we talk about American exceptionalism, this is what it looks like and it leads to, because it turns into this every person for themselves. And then that means that people who don't have the protections that they need are going to die. And I'll also just add that, like, I actually think that the way that the United States is handling the pandemic is a form of eugenics, in that they are systemically refusing to offer support systems and healthcare to poor folks, to incarcerated folks, to undocumented immigrants. They refuse to remove them from the immigration jails. They refuse to make sure that homeless people have what they need. And that then means that they're not going to be able to get care, and that's who's going to die off. We have a white supremacist in the White House who believes that, I mean, part of white supremacist ideology is that you are a superior race, therefore your body won't actually get said diseases because you are perfect, which he then got it. But then he had to say that he was like super and he's fine and he's great. He survived it. Like, everyone can survive it, right? But that is part of white supremacist ideology. And so that anyone else who dies, it's just like, well, whatever, they're just that they weren't strong enough. And I think this is what white supremacist ideology in a pandemic looks like. And it's just a shame, because the majority of children who have died from coronavirus have been Black and brown children. So, you know, they can miss me with their Black unborn lives matter, because they're not doing shit to make sure that Black and brown people are thriving, whether it's every day or in this pandemic.
Right. Thank you so much, Renee and Zane, for your spicy answers. We love to see it. I think, if anything, you guys, you women, encapsulated the fact that kind of raising children and policies that police raising children, and if we can raise children, almost determine the destiny of entire communities. And that's what reproductive justice is all about. Thank you so much for that. And on to our next question. So speaking to my specific experience, there's massive cultural barriers can affect conversations surrounding sexual health and relationships, typically in a student kind of environment, as well as in high school. How do you maintain communicating about sexual health, empowerment, while not offending a woman's belief system she has attained at home? So
yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think a couple of things. One, I think we need to challenge the assumption that all beliefs that we learn at home are correct. Because there are a lot of things that we learn at home that are actually really harmful, particularly for Black women and Black and brown women and girls, queer and trans people, because like there's around mental health stigma that like you don't need to go see no doctor about that. Just pray to God and you'll be okay. And it's like, no, actually, people need treatment for depression. And so I think that it's actually okay to challenge that, and to especially because it's making sure that people have the health care that they need, whether it is contraception, abortion, mental health care, transition-related care, any of those things. I think something that I learned at home was, even though my family was very pro-choice and supportive, there were still comments here and there about, don't get pregnant when you're in high school. And, oh, I'm so glad I got Renee through high school without getting pregnant. And, I had cousins who became young parents, and it was kind of like don't be like them. And I think that actually is something that's also learned at home that is wrong. And I think it's okay to challenge that. I think that there was once a time that my parents, because I'm biracial, my parents couldn't get married. And that's a thing that people still teach at home, and it is wrong. So I think it's important that we actually talk about values, and that when I am working with someone and we're talking about stigma that someone may have learned at home, I first want to talk to them about their values. And let's actually talk about what values we have, because I also think that there are different interpretations. If we're talking about religion or something like that, there are different interpretations of religious beliefs, and, you know, different stories. And I think it's really, really important that we support that exploration, and that helping people like come into their own. I also think that, I'm sorry, no matter what, like stigmatizing your children is not a value to teach. You can be disapproving of their decision to have an abortion, but what is not acceptable is not loving your child no matter what. You can have questions about someone being queer or trans, but you know what? You better get the fuck over it and love your child, because they're family, right? And I think they also, they deserve love. And I think it's okay for them if they want to take a break from you, because if you are unwilling to love them, they don't need that, that pain and that hatred within their own families. So I think that one thing I also work with with a lot of folks when they're thinking about telling their parents or family members about their abortion, it's that there's a lot of assumptions about how someone might feel, or they may preach a certain thing about abortion, knowing damn well they've had an abortion too. And I think we've been thinking a lot at We Testify about abortion legacies and how we're socialized to not talk about abortions. And but I found that once I started talking about mine, I heard from a lot of family members on both sides of my family who've all had abortions. And we all had them isolated and separated from one another. And I think that what would it look like if we actually had pushed back on that together and could have supported one another? Because in a way, having an abortion is actually a thing that we do in our family. Even when society tells us it's a bad thing, or even in a pro-choice family, like it's still considered a thing we don't talk about. And there are a lot of folks who grow up with what are considered religious or anti-abortion parents, and then find out that, oh yeah, actually mom had an abortion after me and before my sibling because, you know, this reason, right? People who are anti a lot of these things, sometimes it is because they're afraid of change, or also because they did it themselves and they're feeling the stigma and isolation. I mean, how many politicians do we see are like passing anti-LGBT bills, and then turns out, you know, they got boyfriends on the side? Like, actually, what would it look like if we taught more values of love, and that, sure, you can disagree with the decision, but at the end of the day, I'm still going to show up and love you. And I think that that's how we should show up, and that is the value that that every person deserves from their family and their friends.
Amazing answer, thank you. Renee?
Yes. So I was going to obviously echoing everything that Renee has said. And, you know, it's all about those conversations that need to be had, right? And I think it's that generational trauma. I know these are buzzwords, but it's real, right? And you don't really recognize how it shows up in the things that, you know, like she said, the values that have been passed down, and you didn't question them. But I think the more exposure you have to other people and to hearing what's going on, whether you agree or not, I think that shapes how folks can be empowered, right? Because I may not have had all of the experiences that someone else has had that I've talked to, but I'm aware of it, right? And so if it came time for me, I have stories, or I have experience of folks that I feel connected with that I can look to for guidance if I can't have that physical conversation. And I think, it's the more we talk about it, the more folks can be empowered. I think one of the things I like to push is self-advocacy, right? And those are skills that have to be learned, because not everyone is comfortable speaking about the things that impact them or sharing it, right? But it's because sometimes it's about trying to understand it yourself. I think about, how RJ came about, right? And, these women in a conference and it's talking and seeing like what was, all of the experiences the shared experiences that they have, but that happened at whatever times in their lives and how they connected over that. So the more you talk about it, the more it raises folks' consciousness about what's happening around them and that you don't feel siloed. And so obviously, because of my public health training, right, I will say like, well, here's the evidence base to it, right? So these are the best and safe practices for you to have in your toolbox, right? But also not negating the pleasure that you should have through your relationships, and, not having the absence of it, right? And talking about it, right? I mean, people don't really like to talk about bad things, right? But sometimes people don't like to talk about the good things, or they can't even recognize the good things. And I think because of so much that has happened in our history and that is still happening to people, that even when they feel that it's good, it's something that stigma that says, well, you shouldn't be feeling good about anything right now. Look at our world. But it's like, why can't I? It's like finding that joy. I think joy is what empowers us all. And no matter what's going on, if folks can identify what joy looks like for them, they won't be empowered to do anything, right? Or to really stay with it or whatever they decide to do. And so, being able to advocate for yourself, being able to understand yourself. I think one of the things about empowerment is like you can talk about it or whatever, but it's like until somebody really knows themselves or understands or learn their bodies, right? Learn your emotions, learn what's going on with you. Because I think when you learn more about yourself, it helps you not only be open to what's happening around you, but it provides some context. And I think knowing more about yourself addresses some of that stigma, right? Because the more folks that know about themselves and are comfortable with themselves and are comfortable with asking what they need for themselves, it won't seem like it's just a segmented thing, because everyone would be doing it. And that would empower everyone. And so I just think about like, when we think about communication, honestly, you need so many channels. It needs to be said 1,000 times just for it to really, put a light bulb in some folks' heads. And I don't think there's no one way to addressing that and achieving that, honestly. But starting with those smaller things, so starting with the values, knowing yourself, getting to understand yourself, understanding what joy is, understanding what pleasure is, and what that looks like for you. Because sometimes some things, it's only going to pertain to you. Sometimes you may be the only person that can bring you through something or encourage yourself through something, whether you are faced with stigma or the oppressiveness of this world. But you find you have that joy, that little piece of joy within you that says, I'm gonna keep on going, right? And so things, get better for me. And if things get better for you, it will get better for those around you. And so I don't know, I like to look at it like a holistic, the holistic approach, right? It's so many things, right? But I do believe, it starts with the individual person. And that's how the collective is built, I think.
Can I just add one other thing?
Thank you so much.
Can I just add one other thing? I think.
Yeah, good. Sorry.
Back to your question, because you were asking about, what the traditions they learned at home. I think an important question to ask yourself internally is, does this tradition feel good? Because if it does not feel good, then maybe there needs to be a change. Because there are a lot of traditions we also learn that are like beautiful, right? There's a lot of beautiful lessons and stories in religions and all of those things, right? And I think it's asking yourself, does this feel like it is a story or a tradition or a rule that is helping me feel whole and good and like a happy person? Or is it one that is making me feel shame and less than who I can be? And as if I don't do XYZ thing, my family is no longer going to love me. Then that is to me seems like that's where you can decide. And you can decide that for yourself. And I think about like, there are people in a lot of really like conservative religions who are like, no, I want to observe like purity culture. And it's not for me. I'll just say that because everyone knows I had an abortion. It ain't for me. Been pregnant, had sex, did it. But for other people, they feel like it is something of value for them. And I think if they enjoy that and they feel like it is a thing, then I think, more power to you. But I think the question is like, are you imposing it on someone else to the point that it does not feel okay for them? And do you actually feel good in it? And I think if you can say, I want to wait to save myself for, my partner or whatever, do that. The question is, can you mandate that for other people? No. Are you going to shame other people if they don't do it? Okay, well, no. And as long as you're doing it freely chosen and you are open to critiquing it, I think that's a place to discuss.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you. Some really, really interesting conversations, especially about kind of wider conversations that need to be had. So slightly linking onto that as our next question about, so mass media like films, kind of books, the news really impact how we think and consequently really does impact our self-image as women. Do you think there's enough mass media that positively advocates for reproductive justice? Because personally, I've found in mass media, whether that's kind of Hollywood narratives or the news, you often have very negative, quite patronizing images of reproductive health and abortion and all those aspects. So what do you guys think about how the mass media portrays reproductive justice?
Yeah, so this is something that I actually study along with my colleagues at the University of California, San Francisco, Dr. Gretchen Sisson and Steph Harold. And we look at representation of abortion in American films and television shows. And it's been on TV for 114 years, or TV and film for 114 years. And the depictions have shifted to more positive, thoughtful, accurate representations. But they still are overwhelmingly white and leave out the stories of people of color. They kind of don't allow, or like, they don't necessarily allow for like nuance within stories. They kind of make all the drama about like, will they, won't they have an abortion? Instead of actually that, like, for most people having an abortion, the drama is around like trying to figure out how to pay for it, or needing support from a family member or something like that, trying to travel. And I think that it's really, it's getting there. But I also think that a lot of stories are getting there. I'm thinking in particular right now of the TV show Insecure on HBO. They have been using the show to show a lot of different things, and one in particular is Amanda Seales' character. I think her name's Tiffany, I think. She is basically dealing with postpartum depression this past season. And they kind of show how it progresses. And so I think that, TV shows, some of them are doing phenomenal work on this, and others are not. Insecure has actually had 2 abortion disclosures, where they kind of talk about they're dealing with unintended pregnancies. I think it's, you know, there are ways in which shows are doing it. It's really fun. It also tracks with who the showrunners are and who the creators are. You're less likely to get an interesting plot line if you have a cis white man who wrote it, directed it, all that kind of stuff. And I think, you know, we're seeing a lot more, like I said, around other pregnancy outcomes. There's a little bit about abortion or adoption, not as much. There have been some more episodes around surrogacy and infertility. So it's starting to show up. Another one that's like just front of mind for me is on Grey's Anatomy. They did a whole episode about this crash cart that a Black woman created at her hospital to try to address the maternal mortality deaths. And they had this crash cart and they showed it on Grey's Anatomy and like talked about how it's like saving people's lives in prenatal care. And so their writer's room, they're really, really great and have been doing a great job of trying to use the script and use the characters to educate the population about various issues, including things like maternal mortality rates and whatnot. So I think we're getting there, but definitely not perfect. And with abortion, I mean, I'm still waiting to see. They keep having these road trip movies about abortion. So Unpregnant, Little Woods, Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always. Little Woods is my favorite one. Unpregnant is also very funny. And Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always is well done. But they're all about white women traveling to get an abortion, when the majority of people who have abortions are people of color. And in Little Fires Everywhere, the TV show on Hulu, Unpregnant, Little Woods, Shrill, all of the characters who are having abortions, they're white and they depend on a friend of color to help them through the abortion. And in two of them, in Unpregnant and in Little Fires Everywhere, they actually blame the friend of color for having an abortion. And I think it's so frustrating that it's like we're getting blamed for them, but we don't get our own narrative and we don't get our own story. So, you know, I think like I said, I think we're slowly getting there. I can't wait to see more self-managed abortion stories, more queer and trans folks, because I don't think we've ever had a trans person have an abortion on TV or film. So, you know, I hope that we can shift it a bit.
Yeah, I definitely echo that too, especially, you know, seeing more representation on shows and all of that. But I think, like you said, sometimes it's the absence of what's really happening to the communities of color. And, you know, I think about, for example, you know, especially with the maternal mortality crisis right now. And, you know, I remember watching the show on, I think it's either Residence or maybe ER, I'm not really sure, but they showed the mom, and I'm blanking on her name, who had the complications, right? And her husband, you know, was trying to get the doctor's attention and just all of that, right? And yeah, that's a typical, with, you know, let me not say typical, but, you know, that is heart-wrenching, and that's, you know, raising awareness about what's happening. We hear about celebrities like Serena Williams and Beyonce, who also had complications. But I think about, you know, my best friend, right, who, you know, she had complications with having my niece, and you know, she really hadn't heard other stories around in the family circle, right, about other folks having complications, right? She saw it on the show and like kind of heard about other celebrity stories, but when it came time for her experience, what grounded her was the conversation that her and I had, right? To say that, ask about this. If something's wrong, say that. Because she actually started to, she had a C-section. She had actually planned to have a home birth. She actually came out of pocket to get a midwife. And so, because when she found out she was pregnant, she went to the doctor. She didn't have a great experience. And so she, took the necessary precautions, to do that at home. And she still had complications, right? Because she ended up in the hospital. She had a C-section. She was hemorrhaging, internal bleeding, and her blood pressure was dropping. And, she knows that I'm in the field, right? And, she called me and she was saying that she was so scared, right? And she was like, she only could talk to me about it, not because I had a similar experience, but I knew what was happening in our community. I knew what was happening with those stories that weren't highlighted in the media. I knew what was happening to everyday women, right? And for her to know that happened and has been happening all of this time, you hear about women, Black women who are highly educated, who, are still having worse, more complications and worse outcomes than a white woman who only has an 8th grade education or only a high school diploma and things like that. And, she wasn't really able to put that in context until she experienced it. And so I think, I say all that to say that it's amplifying those stories that are happening in the community, because when that happened, I was like, oh yeah, I'm in the right space, because she called me, right? I'm not a doctor. She didn't even want me to come up there, but she wanted me to know that because of just the conversations that we've had. And, I was checking, I'm like, make sure you don't have gestational diabetes. I'm asking stuff or whatever. And to her, that helped, because when it came time for the complications, no one else understood what was going on. She felt that she could call me and understand what was happening. And so actually, when she started to see other shows that depicted that, the trauma, she relived the trauma again, right? And she wasn't even comfortable telling her story. And I think that's the other thing too, about really uplifting folks' experiences, to tell them that you need to share this. I honestly don't want to see actors, like, I would want her to tell her story. I wouldn't want to see like a Issa Rae tell that story, right? Or somebody else tell that story. It's more impactful when it comes from her. It's more impactful when it comes from those folks who have actually experienced it. Let them become the ones that are highlighted. And obviously, I know, I'm not in television or whatever, Hollywood. I know how it all works, whatever. But it's nothing like that authentic storytelling that really moves folks and gets them involved and helps shape the conversation and the image of what it looks like to be Black and brown in this world. Because honestly, I know it's for educational purposes and to bring awareness, because they know folks are watching these shows and things like that. But hearing it from my best friend, oh, that took me over the roof, okay? And so it's like, now I'm telling her, I'm not pushing you to tell your story. I told her that because I want to respect and honor you. But I said, folks need to hear what happened to you. And she has started to share her story. And that has helped her open up a little bit more and realize what happened with postpartum and all of those things that Black folks aren't really talking about, right? And so I say all that to say, mass media is great. I'm sure it's more that we can do. There's never enough. But I think really amplifying the stories of the real people who are experiencing this is really going to have the most impact for us moving forward. And so that people will know that, no, this is happening to the woman next door. This is happening to your neighbor down the street. It's not so far-fetched. It's not so far removed from you. It's right there. And, 1 degree of separation for you, if that, or within your own household. And I think it's important for us to use that to uplift. And I don't know if it's through documentaries, because depending on these shows and who's running it, the money, whatever, how they want to do it. But if it's even us uplifting our own stories, I think that's what's going to make the change and can really push RJ forward in a positive light. It's already in a positive light, but just more so people can see how it's really connected to their everyday life.
Right. That was really invaluable. So we got time for one last question, just quickly, 2 answers. And then audience, if you guys have any questions, if you guys have any comments, please don't be afraid. You can put it in the chat bar. And if we have time, please stick around. I'm sure the panelists have a few more minutes to take some questions. But yeah, on to the last question. So reproductive justice aims to achieve concrete real-world change in a world driven by economic gain. What is the economic gain of instituting reproductive justice for women? So Zanae, Renee, any one of you guys can start with that.
I'll just say quickly, I think that that's a really interesting question. I'm working really hard on kind of unlearning the capitalism that we just like live in and breathe every day in the United States. And I think, you're saying an economic gain that we get from it. I mean, I think there are things that like people are able to do with their lives and achieve their dreams, but like, I don't necessarily think there needs to be an economic gain at all. The point is to make sure that people are able to make decisions for their lives and live their best lives. I've seen people argue in support of the coronavirus, like restrictions like wearing a mask. They're like, this much money will be saved in the economy. And I'm like, also people's lives. That seems important to me. So to me, I mean, of course, there's like, people are able to like do certain things and with their lives and all that and whatever. But at the end of the day, people are able to make the best decisions for themselves and their futures, and they get to determine their futures. And that feels like the most important thing for me.
Yeah, that when I read that question, I was like, that's very interesting. How would I word it? Obviously, you have the typical answer, right? It's like, obviously, for women, girls, and individuals to have the economic, the social and political power to be able to achieve those things without restrictions. But just like Renee said, unlearning those isms. Because obviously, when you think of economic, it's about the dollars. I mean, like, it's the dollars. It's what's being produced, honestly. And so, I don't know. I think it can't be achieved until we unlearn some things and learn some new things and figure out some new ways to live that is respectful of that. And it's going to take some time. But I just think, unlearning and also reshaping what that looks like. So that way it's achievable for everyone.
Thank you so much, both of you guys again. Renee, I think you have to leave now, don't you? So I want to say a huge thank you for taking part. Thank you for all your contributions. It's been really amazing and inspiring to listen to you. Janae, are you happy to stay on if there are any more audience questions, or do you have time limits?
I can stay on. Yeah.
Thank you
so
all
much
for having me. I have to run for another call, but thank you so much for having me. And, hopefully you can do this again.
Yes. Thank you.
So yeah, does anyone in the audience have any questions they'd feel comfortable asking? Feel free to just put it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask, because obviously Janae is an expert on this, so if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
Obviously, imposter syndrome immediately triggers me. You're your expert.
If someone is out, also, if you want to ask your question using your own words instead of over the chat, just let us know and we'll unmute you.
Okay. So we have a question from Charlotte, which says, in terms of the wider abortion debate, how do we get people to see that you can be both pro-life and pro-choice? We're actively forcing women to have babies, but we're not forcing anyone to have an abortion.
So that question sounds like it was best suited for Renee to answer, honestly, because she's in the field with that. For me, I have somewhat of the broader view. And so I think getting people to see that you can be both, I think that just happens with folks' life experiences and what they're exposed to. Because what I just was so humdrum about years ago, I'm not necessarily humdrum about now. And so I think, although some components of it can be detrimental to communities, especially how people speak about it and the way it is highlighted, but I think, I don't know. I just think that, things change and you can be both or the other. And I just think the basic underlying thing is respect. I'm just going to keep going to that respect with whatever you decide to be on, whether it's both or one or the other.
Any other questions from anyone? Oh, please go ahead.
Hi. I was just wondering if you think that reproductive justice is being considered, if at all, and if it is, if it's being considered well within the current conversation to do with climate change. I don't know, either just specifically in America or like globally, what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think there's more awareness that's happening, right? Because when people think of reproductive justice, they automatically think about, obviously, the reproductive health system. But it's now, I think more people are understanding that it's about where we live and how that impacts us. I think there was a study that said that, I don't know if it was residential segregation or what, but in a certain area that was highly a community of color, the heat index was higher or something like that. It was a study about that. And so just saying, like, well, why would one area of a community be hotter than the other? But that's a reproductive justice issue. And so I think folks are starting to realize that reproductive justice looks at the social determinants of health, right, that most folks think about, and climate change does impact that, right? Especially when we think about RJ and climate change in terms of menstrual equity and the type of menstrual products that are being produced and what that does to the climate change efforts. And so I think people are more awareness is being raised and people are starting to see how it all connects. I think that's what's happening because there's so many issues, but environmental justice is reproductive justice, just like mass incarceration is reproductive justice. And so I think, again, more awareness is being raised, and I think more folks are starting to see how all of it is connected. Like, it's not just a silo thing. It's like literally everything that happens in our lives connects to reproductive justice.
Wow. That was really good. Thanks, Ine. Any other questions from anyone else? If not, we can say our goodbyes.
Well, thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. Definitely learned a lot, especially from hearing from Renee. And so thank you all for creating this space for folks. I really do appreciate it. And thank you guys for considering me an expert. I'm working on this imposter syndrome, but we'll get.
Yeah. Thank you. Genuinely, such a kind of inspiring and enlightening conversation from both of you. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for coming. I hope you learned a lot and it was thought-provoking for you all.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Feel free to leave.
Wait, everyone just thinks it's going to end for everyone. Okay, thank you, ladies.